Today, we're going to discuss the best diets for cancer. There are several different approaches we'll cover, all focused on what to eat if you have cancer. When most people ask their doctors, "What should I eat?" they're often told it doesn't matter. Eat whatever you want. To me, that advice couldn't be more wrong. The foods you choose can either feed cancer or help starve it. Now, I'm not here to sell you a diet, a supplement, or any product. Everything I share is for educational purposes only, and you should always check with your doctor before making changes based on what I'm about to explain. Some might criticize this video and ask, what does Dr. Berg really know about cancer? To that, I'd simply point you to several research papers I've contributed to, which are linked below. Once you go through them, I believe you'll find this information well-founded and logical. If someone tries to discourage you from exploring this topic, ask them one simple question. Do they have a better solution? Because the truth is, despite spending trillions of dollars on cancer research, we still haven't solved the problem. Mortality rates from cancer treatments today remain nearly the same as they were decades ago. Now before we go further, there are a few things you need to understand about cancer itself. First, cancer is The term comes from the Greek word hetero, meaning different, and genes, meaning kind or type. In other words, cancer isn't one single disease, it's many different types of disorders. Second, cancer cells are actually very sick cells. They originate from normal cells whose mitochondria, the cell's energy producers, have been damaged. When that happens, the cell switches to a Plan B survival mode. Understanding this process helps us identify cancer's weak spots, its vulnerabilities that we can target. Some treatments, for instance, focus on increasing oxygen in the body to stress and weaken cancer cells. This can include hyperbaric oxygen therapy or even exercise, which floods the body with more oxygen. Higher oxygen levels can actually harm cancer cells and slow their growth. Another key point is that cancer often spreads to areas of inflammation and low oxygen within the body. It also constantly tries to evade the immune system, which normally uses specialized cells to detect and destroy cancer. This brings us to the topic of chemotherapy. While chemotherapy does kill cancer cells, it also damages parts of the immune system in the process. That's why it's crucial to not only target the cancer, but also understand and strengthen our immune defenses, which I'll discuss shortly. As a side note, vitamin D plays an essential role in supporting the immune system. Interestingly, cancer cells often block vitamin D receptors, allowing them to survive more effectively. Knowing this, it may be wise to maintain higher than normal vitamin D levels to help bypass these blockages and overcome the resistance cancer creates in those receptors. I'll cover that in more depth in the next section. Here's another important concept. Cancer cells rely on specific fuels for energy. For example, some cancers primarily use glucose to function. Understanding the fuel preference and genetic makeup of a particular cancer gives us a potential strategy. If we can identify what it feeds on, we can work to starve it of that energy source. Most cancers thrive on glucose and glutamine and amino acid, especially the fast-growing types. However, this creates another challenge. If you deprive cancer of one fuel source but continue eating the same way, it can adapt and start using a different type of fuel instead. Some cancers, for instance, can utilize lipids fats, particularly those influenced by hormones. Others can metabolize branched-chain amino acids as an energy source. And contrary to popular belief, some cancers, even though it's rare, can also use ketones to build and sustain their cell membranes. more, especially in advanced or late. This is why you can't rely on just one approach when addressing cancer. It's an incredibly adaptive disease that will do whatever it takes to survive. Even during chemotherapy, while many cancer cells are destroyed, a small number often survive, and those remaining cells tend to become stronger, more resistant, and harder to kill over time. Just like when you take antibiotics, most bacteria are destroyed, but a few survive and become resistant. The same concept applies to cancer treatment. If someone tells you that chemotherapy or radiation will completely cure your cancer, and it doesn't, this is often the reason why. Now, to be very clear, I'm not telling you to avoid chemotherapy or radiation. That's a decision you must make with your doctor. What I'm sharing here is information you can use alongside conventional treatments or even independently with your doctor's approval. I'm not prescribing or instructing you what to do. My goal is simply to provide useful information. But I will say this, having multiple strategies can make a real difference. One of those strategies involves rotating your diet. By changing your eating pattern periodically, which I'll show you how to do, you can help prevent cancer cells from adapting to a single fuel source and effectively starve them of energy. I also highly recommend intermittent fasting, either 2 meals a day or even 1 meal a day if possible. Why? Because fasting helps restrict the fuel and resources that cancer cells depend on, while allowing your body to shift into repair mode. This process, known as autophagy, enables the body to recycle old and damaged tissues, supporting overall healing. Additionally, every food included in these diets has been selected for its cancer properties. So you're not just eating to fill your stomach, but to nourish and protect your body at the cellular level. Now, with that foundation laid, let's move into the next stage, the diet itself. I've created a detailed downloadable guide you can access for free below. It includes all the specific meal plans, food lists, and rotation schedules. If I tried to cover every single diet and cancer type in one video, it would take hours. So this document gives you everything in depth. We've already talked about how different cancers depend on different fuels. Yes. Some thrive on glucose or glutamine, while others rely on lipids, fats, branched-chain amino acids, or even ketones, particularly the more aggressive late-stage cancers. For example, cancers such as glioblastoma, colorectal, breast, lung, head and neck, and cervical cancers all tend to favor glucose as their primary fuel. When you download the document, you'll be able to look up your specific cancer type and see exactly which fuel it uses most. So you can tailor your diet accordingly. And as I mentioned earlier, even within one type, like breast cancer, there are multiple subtypes, which is why it appears in more than one category in the guide. If you understand the genetic profile of your breast cancer, you can determine which category it falls into. In advanced or stage 4 breast cancer, for example, when it has already spread to other tissues, you may be dealing with 2 different cancer cell types, one that thrives on glucose and another that depends on glutamine. That's exactly why these diets are designed the way they are. For instance, you would start with an anti-glucose diet, which eliminates glucose for sure days if your cancer type fits that category. Then you'd switch to an anti-glutamine diet, removing glutamine from your meals for about 0 days. This rotation allows you to starve both groups of cancer cells, those that depend on glucose and those that feed on glutamine, without giving either group time to adapt or dominate. The anti-glucose phase is essentially a ketogenic diet, while the anti-glutamine phase focuses on mostly plant-based foods. You simply rotate between the two, back and forth, on a continuous cycle. For example, let's say you're dealing with melanoma. In that case, you would begin with the anti-glucose diet for Wu-2 Chid days, followed by the anti-glutamine diet for Cheeto Sur days, and then rotate back again. If you're addressing prostate cancer, which can survive on lipids fats, you'd start with the anti-glucose diet for only Urticaran days, a much shorter phase, and then move into the anti-lipid diet. This version of the plan is low in fats, but not completely fat-free. You're still allowed to consume healthy fats like omega-3 fatty acids, which actually have anti-cancer properties. So while the goal is to reduce fats as a fuel source for cancer, certain types of fats remain beneficial and safe. For liver cancer, the rotation is slightly different. You'd begin with the anti-glucose diet for Wu-2 Chiv days, then switch to the anti-branched chain amino acid diet. This one can be challenging to follow since branched chain amino acids appear in many foods, but the plan outlines exactly what you can eat. It focuses heavily on plant-based meals for that phase. After Cheeto Sur days, you'd return to the anti-glucose phase and repeat the cycle. It's important to understand that the diet for preventing cancer is very different from the diet for treating cancer. Once cancer develops, your approach has to be more aggressive and strategic, rotating diets, restricting certain fuels, and sometimes managing treatments like chemotherapy alongside everything else. It can be overwhelming, especially with all the fear and uncertainty surrounding different prognoses, but having a structured plan can make a huge difference in staying proactive and in control. Dealing with cancer can be extremely stressful and confusing, especially when everyone around you has a different opinion or advice to share. But if you're watching this and you don't have cancer, I strongly recommend following a healthy version of the ketogenic diet combined with intermittent fasting to help reduce your risk of developing it in the first place. Now when it comes to ketones, there's quite a bit of controversy. I already know I'll get comments and disagreements about this, but I encourage you to look at the research yourself. I'll admit, even I was initially skeptical about the idea that ketones could serve as fuel for certain cancers. It didn't make sense to me at first, but after diving deeper into the data, I realized that, unfortunately, some evidence supports it, particularly in aggressive late-stage cancers. The key point here is that cancer will do anything to survive, adapting to whatever fuel it can find. That's why it's so important to understand how to approach diet strategically in advanced cancer cases. For instance, you might not even begin with the anti-glucose ketogenic diet, since ketones themselves could become a potential energy source for those specific cancer types. Instead, in late-stage or aggressive cancers, you'd likely move toward anti-glutamine and anti-ketone diets, which are primarily plant-based and low in protein. However, because your body still needs protein for repair and strength, you might include a short phase, perhaps 1 to 3 days, where you consume a small amount of protein before returning to the plant-based rotations. It's a bit more complex and delicate, but that's how you maintain balance while still restricting the cancer's fuel sources. This is also why in some of my other videos, I explain that one of the most powerful things you can do when facing advanced cancer is prolonged fasting. There are documented cases of people with stage 4 cancer who fasted for a full month or even longer and saw remarkable results. Fasting can deeply weaken cancer cells because it deprives them of all fuel sources at once. Now, I know some people might ask, but wait, during fasting, your body produces ketones. Wouldn't that just feed the cancer? Interestingly, the ketones produced during fasting don't appear to nourish cancer cells the same way dietary ketones do. In fact, during prolonged fasting, the body shifts into a state that makes it much harder for cancer cells to survive or multiply. For each cancer type and its corresponding fuel source, I've also included a list of key supplements that can help block those fuels, whether it's glucose, glutamine, or ketones. Next, let's talk about vitamin D. It's absolutely essential to keep your vitamin D blood levels around course to EBET nanograms per milliliter, and you should also aim to get plenty of sunlight exposure. Both vitamin D and natural sunlight provide incredible therapeutic benefits for your mitochondria and immune system. Exercise is another powerful tool. It boosts oxygen levels and strengthens your mitochondria, which can actually help destroy cancer cells. And of course, as I've emphasized before, fasting, whether 2 meals a day or even one, should become part of your regular routine. Now here's something very important about prolonged fasting. The longer you can safely fast, the more effective it becomes. I recommend doing a Archer-Sif minus Sir-Shabbat or Titishar hour fast, or even longer, once or twice every 2 to 3 weeks. But don't follow a strict pattern, vary it up. Cancer cells can sometimes adapt to predictable routines, so you want to keep your schedule random and flexible. For example, you might do a Shabbat hour fast next week, then wait 2 weeks and try a Tishar hour fast, and a week later, maybe go for a Uday fast. This kind of strategic, varied fasting can be highly effective against certain cancers by keeping them off balance and limiting their fuel supply. I know this might sound like a lot to take in, but don't worry, I've made it easy to follow. I've provided a download link in the description where you can get the full guide. You can print it out, study it, share it with your doctor, and use it as a reference as you continue your research. And if you haven't already seen my other video on what to eat to prevent cancer, make sure to watch that next. I've linked it right here. It's packed with crucial information that ties perfectly into everything we've talked about today.